Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today I am finally doing one that has been highly suggested over the last year, and that is my rhipsalis collection and care video. And I thought that I would also do a little Q&A at the end just to answer all of the questions that you have. We're just gonna get started. I'm gonna go through my very humble collection first. I'm gonna kind of give you a rundown of where they are in the house, the light that I'm giving it, the care, go over the substrate. I don't have very many rhipsalis. There's only 10 to go through today, and we're gonna get through them fairly quickly because I do not want today to be too long. So yeah, let me just bring out the first one. Actually, before I show you the first one, I just kind of wanted to give you two quick fun facts about rhipsalis. So they are mostly native to Brazil / South America. I believe you will find them in other areas of the world, but that they're not native there. They have just been brought there somehow, but they are also growing in the wild in other places other than Brazil / South America. So there's that, and then also rhipsalis are actually primarily epiphytic species, just like our aroids, meaning they grow in trees, they grow up the sides of things, they grow in the canopy. So if you look at photos of rhipsalis in the wild, which is actually just so insanely beautiful. To me, it's almost more beautiful than seeing an aroid in the wild. There's something about seeing those trailing, what do we call these things? They're not leaves, just a trailing rhipsalis in the wild, grown so like bushy and just crazy. It literally blows my mind. So typically you're gonna find them in the canopies or like in the trees, but there are also some species of rhipsalis that are lithophytic, and I hope I'm saying that right, meaning they will grow just in the cracks of rocks, which is also kind of wild. So anyway, just two little fun facts for you if you're curious. So I'm gonna just bring out the first guy, and I wanted to start with this because this was actually the rhipsalis that started it all for me. When I acquired this in what I think was 2019, I actually just got this from Lowe's, and it was like a pot that was maybe like this big. It was just barely starting to trail out of the pot. I thought this was like some kind of succulent or something. I didn't really know anything about rhipsalis, didn't know they existed, but this was my gateway rhipsalis. So I have been calling this a rhipsalis. I called it a baccifera for many years, which was wrong. So now I'm calling it either a capilliformis or a pulchra. They look very similar. I don't know if they are like basically synonyms for each other, but that's my best guess in terms of an ID. This one has always been sitting on this shelf here, so I just want to quickly talk about the light really quick. So what I'm using to convey my light measurements to you, it's going to be from this little nifty gadget. So this is the Houseplant Journal LTH meter, light temperature humidity reader. You can find things like this on Amazon, but I think this is the only 3-in-1 that exists on the market right now. I do have a code for you. I have to remember what it is, and I'll link it in the description if I can find it, where you can get a little bit of a discount. So yeah, this is the LTH meter. It reads light in foot candles. So I know a lot of people aren't really going to understand foot candle readings. I do have a whole video dedicated to it. I will also link it in the description if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about it. But just to give you some context or something to compare it to, in the window, right in my south facing window on a sunny day like this, the readings are going to be anywhere from like 1200 or 2000 even upward to like 5000. Which is very, very high, very bright, lots of sun. And then on this shelf, on a sunny day like this, pretty much at the time of day that it is right now, and it's 11:45 in the morning, this shelf or this wall gets a solid, I would say, 3 hours of direct light when we have the sun that like comes out every once in a while. And that reading is gonna be anywhere from like 300 to maybe not 2000, maybe like, actually maybe 2000. I wouldn't be surprised in this region if it was reading at 2000. But that is on a good day. And just bear in mind, I live in Canada and we don't have many sunny days like this, like at all. Well, I'm not gonna say at all. Summers are beautiful here. Our summers go from like June to August to be safe. And then after August, you know, we start getting basically overcast. And so on days like those, which is gonna be most of the year for me, I would take whatever reading that I'm throwing up on the screen for each plant, chop it in half or even by 3/4, because in the winter, the foot candle readings are so low. They're so embarrassingly low. I don't even know how some of my plants survive it. But yeah, so I'm gonna throw in, because I wanted to throw in some readings of when it's not super sunny. So I'm gonna throw in 2 readings on the screen of when it's sunny and when it is overcast. So anyway, sorry, just to get that out of the way, because I just want to give you guys a good idea of exactly what readings these are getting in terms of light. So with all that said, this is living on the shelf. You can see that I do have some 10-watt Barina bars, which I want to turn off because on sunny days like this, we don't really need the lights. You can see that I do have the 10-watt Barinas in there. It's not making really a huge difference for this plant though, because it's not like it's sitting directly under the light, it's just cascading in the front of the shelf. So whatever light that this is getting, it's getting from the windows. So that is the light situation. And then, sorry, just looking at my notes here. And as you can see, it's living in a no drainage vessel. You're gonna hear me saying that a lot because every single one of my rhipsalis are living in no drainage. I just find that that's the best way for me to grow them because I do find them to be very thirsty. This one in particular, I would say is my thirstiest rhipsalis. I'm not sure if it's because it's the largest one, but this one, when it was living with drainage, it was just too thirsty. I was watering it like twice a week. So now that it's living in no drainage, it's in a mixture of just straight soil. It's got lots of coarse perlite. It has fir bark, worm castings, just kind of your typical aeroid mix, and doing just fine. This one I'm watering once a week. It is very, very thirsty. If I ever let this thing dry out completely, it is very forgiving. I will say it's forgiving in a sense that the roots are kind of like Hoyas, where it can go longer periods without water and the roots won't die from like dry rot or something, but you will notice a lot of shedding on this plant. And I can show you kind of, can you see? Over here. It's not a lot of shedding from the actual leaves, but you'll notice that it pushes out a lot of these aerial roots because, like I mentioned before, they're epiphytic, lithophytic, and they're gonna be climbing other things, finding its way in between rocks. So when you let it dry out, all of these little aerial roots kind of just like fall off. But in terms of like actual shedding, like this, it's actually very minimal. The only time I notice that a lot of shedding happens in terms of these little arms are if it's just bone dry, completely dry. But other than that, it actually doesn't shed a lot. And it's surprising because you would see this thing, and I don't know, to me, it strikes me as a plant that just constantly sheds. And so that's been really nice. I've had people tell me that theirs have shed a lot, and I'm not sure what their conditions are, but my recommendation would be to just make sure that it has a constant source of water. And you should be okay, but you should expect a lot of these aerial roots that are like growing out of it, and there's quite a few. You should expect those to shed. I don't really think that there's anything you can do about it, and it is all over me. So I don't really have much else to say about this one besides the fact that it's just so magical and wonderful. I didn't realize how much I would be loving this thing as it got longer. I do trim this one back, I wouldn't say like pretty often, but I want to say every 3 months. I just give it a good trim so that more can grow from the top, and you can kind of see a lot of this new growth happening up there. I'm like almost certain that's because I'm every 3 months, every 3 to 4 months, I just kind of snip from the top and encourage more growth so that we can get a nice big bushy pot. So yeah, that is the first one. So the next one is one that you have seen recently if you watched my Am I the A-hole repot and chat that went up last week. So this is my rhipsalis micrantha SSP kerbergii. I used to think that this was a rhipsalis pentaptera. It is definitely not a pentaptera now that it has grown out a lot more. I'm still not 100% sure about the ID, but if I look at photos, this seems more accurate than the pentaptera, so that's what I'm gonna call it for now. I've had this one for probably, I wanna say a year now. I bought it as I wanna say it was a 4-inch pot. All of the strands kind of looked like this. It was a very, very humble, tiny pot, and it had a little bit of this weird sort of like rusty copper stuff. Like it looks a bit sickly, but a lot of the new growth has grown in nice and green. So I'm just kind of hoping that it stays that way. In terms of light, I'm gonna throw in the measurements, of course, and it's just living on a bottom shelf in my, on my living room shelf. And it is getting direct light from my 10-watt Barina bar. Also, again, living in no drainage, living in soil. I have a little reserve of leca, but just keep in mind, this is a brand new setup. I had this initially growing in pon, and I just don't think it liked it. It was shedding so much. And I don't know if that's because this type of rhipsalis just sheds a lot, or if it was the care that I was giving it. So this is fairly new. I can't really say much about how it's been doing in soil, but I will let you know once I know. But even when it was living in pon, it was living in no drainage, and yeah, shedding it was just so much. Like pretty much every week I'd have like a little pile of little arms on the shelf, so that wasn't very fun, and that's probably why this thing is as small as it is now, even after a year. So this is gonna be one of my projects this year. Actually, 2024, I really want to focus on my anthurium, my climbing philodendron, and my trailing guys. I just want some nice big bushy pots, and so this is no exception. At this point in time, I'm not gonna say that this is like my favorite rhipsalis or even one that I'm just like really, really loving. Again, I bought it because I thought it was a pentaptera, and I really love the pentaptera, and I will go through some of my wish list rhipsalis later on in this video, but I'm willing to give it some time, because a lot of rhipsalis that you see in really small 2, 3, 4-inch pots, they are very unassuming, it just doesn't really look like much, and I just think you have to wait until it starts trailing, because that's when you start to really appreciate it more. Because I can't say with my capilliformis or pulchra or whatever it is, if it was in like a tiny 2-inch pot, I'm not sure I'd be like, oh my gosh, like I need this rhipsalis. But if I saw this as it was in the store, I don't care what the price is, I would have paid it. It would have came home with me. So this is another one that I'm just kind of waiting to see what happens. But if you look at like the fuller baskets online, or you look at, you know, big mature plants of these, they are quite magical. So we're just gonna give it some time and see how it does. I don't think I have ever shown this on my channel yet, and I think that's because I was waiting to post this video, and I know it doesn't look like much, but I did a trade recently, a rhipsalis trade, and I have finally acquired my hoelleri. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I included this in my wish list video from I think last year or maybe even the year before. But this is one of the rhipsalis that I just really, really wanted. So it's very similar to the baccifera, but it just has longer spaghetti noodles between the knuckles. Whereas with the baccifera, there's like way more knuckles in between the spaghetti arms. And I just am so smitten with this. I've only had this for a few months. I think it's only been 2 months. Haven't had any new growth on it yet, but I have plenty of new roots, and it's also living in soil, no drainage, no reservoir, doing totally fine. I can't really say too much about the watering requirements or anything because I've had it for such little time. I just water it as much as I water the rest of my plants. And this one is living on this wall here on my invisible shelves. I've seen really mature photos of the hoelleri, like big, long trailing baskets, and I have to say for me, it's probably one of the most beautiful, maybe next to the paradoxa. There's just something about it. I don't know if it's because there's not a ton of like, kind of like the capilliformis, where you can see it kind of like branches off a lot to give it sort of like that bushy look. Whereas this one is just more like, just long, just like really long and just really noodle-like, and it's so cool. So I really hope to see some like nice growth in the next year. I have never propagated this one before. I'm not really scared to propagate rhipsalis, and I will talk about that later. But yeah, this is another one that I'm gonna baby with every fiber of my being. I do want to try and propagate it at least once or twice next year to pot back, because right now this is just two strands. So it's this guy here and then this long one. But yeah, very happy to have this one in the collection. This is one of my favorite rhipsalis ever. This is the actual rhipsalis baccifera. Again, very similar to the hoelleri in that they've got like thick spaghetti noodle-like arms, but there's just way more branching off, and you'll notice that like the spaghetti noodles aren't so long. So this one is gonna be sort of a bushier one, but I thought I did. I felt it shed. Besides that happening, I actually don't find this one to be a very big shedder. So this one's also living on this shelf, and I don't even remember the last time I would have seen like one of these guys like on the floor or something, honestly. The only time that I notice shedding is when I'm like fussing with it or fiddling with it. But yeah, this one does not really shed a whole lot. But I just love how like fat and thick these noodles are. They're so good. They have a slight fuzz to it. It's kind of hard to see, but there's like little white dots on each of the noodles, and they've got like this micro fuzz to it. So that's like a nice touch. Also with no drainage, this one was repotted recently because the vessel it was in was so algae ridden I couldn't even see inside it anymore. But it was the same thing, just soil, no reserve. And it's been fine, because when I acquired this, the strands were like, they weren't even like trailing out of the pot yet. They were kind of just like sticking straight up. So it really wasn't until this year that I noticed a lot of growth kind of trailing and spilling along the sides. And I'm finally starting to like get the baccifera that I've been wanting, because I get so jealous when I see people in like New Zealand, Australia, you know, just places across the world where they just sell them in these huge long trailing baskets. And I've actually never seen a baccifera that big offered in the States or here. So obviously I've got to do it myself, which isn't bad because it's been fun to kind of see this thing grow. I do think it has the potential to grow longer spaghetti noodles without as much branching if I was giving it more light. But I'm actually fine with this growth, because with more branching, it actually looks bigger than it is, and I don't feel the need to propagate it as much. So yeah, baccifera, really fun one if you can find this. I consider this to be a very easy rhipsalis to grow. It's kind of like a no fuss, no BS rhipsalis. Next little guy is my rhipsalis micrantha. This is one of the newer rhipsalis in my collection. So I don't know a whole lot about it at this point, but I can tell you that since I've had it, it's been fine. It's been good. It's been pretty easy. This one's also living on this shelf here, so getting pretty much the same foot candle measurements as my baccifera. I do have a bit of new growth down at the bottom. This one has been a slower one for me. I'm not sure if it's because it's in such a small vessel and probably needs to be repotted. This is one of the very few rhipsalis, actually maybe my only, no, not my only rhipsalis in pond, but one of the few rhipsalis that I have in pond. But again, also in no drainage. I have noticed, and I can't remember if this was on it before I acquired it or it happened in my care, but I'm also seeing some of those sort of like rusty spots like my kerbergii. But I haven't really noticed that it's affected it a whole lot. I mean, it's still growing. It seems fairly happy and healthy. But yeah, it's another really cool one because it's different in that they're not like plump spaghetti noodles. They're kind of like fettuccine noodles. They're nice and flat. And as a trailing, like a big bushy trailing basket, it's really beautiful. I got this from my friend Jing. I'll throw in a photo of hers. Hers is just really, really nice. So I'm hoping maybe I can propagate it today, but I was hoping by now it would have had a little bit more growth and I could have chopped it and put it back in here so that we can have a little bit more, because this is not really giving much right now. But one thing about rhipsalis is that you just have to be patient, because they can be fast growing in certain conditions, in certain seasons, but it's not one that like you're gonna acquire as a small plant and then by like the next year it's gonna be like this big basket. You know, it is kind of like a slow burn. So yeah, this one we're just gonna have to wait. In terms of watering, it has been pretty thirsty, but I think it's because it's just in the world's tiniest vessel and it probably can be upsized by now. But I'm watering this 1 to 2 times a week, and again, it's not even getting that much light on the shelf here. So I can't imagine if this was in like a brighter area or something, like somewhere getting direct sun, it probably would need multiple waterings every week, which I cannot handle. Next one is probably my favorite rhipsalis in my collection. This was like my #1 wish list paradoxa rhipsalis before I actually had it, and that is the rhipsalis paradoxa. I've had this for almost 2.5 years now. I can't remember if I acquired this in 2021 or 2022, but it would have been around that time. And I got it from someone locally, and she had just given me a few cuttings that were maybe like this big. So it has been a lot of TLC and a lot of love to get it to where it is now. But keep in mind, I have chopped this thing back more times than I can remember. I've given away so many cuttings to multiple friends, multiple family members, neighbors, and it's just such a shareable plant. But yeah, this, I just don't know, something about the shape of these chains just like get me. I love looking at it. It's one of my favorite plants in my entire collection. Like if I could only pick 5 plants to keep, I would have to keep this one. I do have a second rhipsalis paradoxa that I'm not going to bring out because I haven't really had that one for very long, but this one has been sort of one of my pride and joys. So this one's living in a very, very algae-ridden pond mixture, also in no drainage. I do want to move this one out into a larger pot and clean pond sometime soon. But even though we're like in the middle of winter, I've been noticing a lot of new growth on it, and so I haven't really wanted to touch it. But now that everything kind of seems hardened off, I'm going to repot this soon. Shedding on this plant, it's pretty much non-existent in my care, at least. I've never actually had any of these noodles fall off before. The only time it's ever been removed is when I removed it. I've had some that like kind of like shrivel and die, but that was when I was like, I don't know, I feel like I wasn't fertilizing it enough. I feel like I was letting it go too long without water. That's one thing I can say about this plant, is that it has a high tendency to rot, but it loves water. It's kind of like an oxymoron, and I'll talk about it a little bit later in this video. But if you are looking for just like the dream rhipsalis, like the it girl of the rhipsalis, I have to recommend this one. It's my favorite. It's so nice to touch. It's so beautiful to look at. Even on a shelf full of aroids, you can just stick it on there and it fits in just fine. So yeah, this is one that I definitely plan to keep propagating, keep taking cuttings of. I want a big, beautiful 360 hanging basket one day. That is my dream for this rhipsalis. So hopefully we can get there soon. The next one is my rhipsalis salicornioides. If you have been on this channel throughout the years, you'll know that I had a much larger pot of this. It was like a crawling pot. It was a huge, ginormous thing. and it was even bigger before I chopped it in half. But the reason that I got rid of most of it, and this is all that I have left, is because of the shedding. I don't know when it switched, but I swear to my recollection, in the first year that I had it, it just didn't shed. Like, I mean, it shed a little bit, but not to the extent that it did at the end when I just got a little bit too fed up with it. So this is all I have left, and it's in water, and it's still shedding like crazy. I love the way these look though, because it's so like alien-like, and it is fun once it gets to trailing, and it's just such a cool rhipsalis. Like, I can't seem to just get rid of it fully yet, because I really, really love it. I think it's such a cool one, but the shedding is it's so bad for me, and it's just all over the floor, it's all over the shelf, and it's like almost every day I'm losing like a piece of this. And I don't know, I used to think that it was the watering, because the pot that I had it in before, it was a very like sandy, gritty, succulent mix almost, and it had drainage holes, and it would dry out so fast. So I was like, oh, it's probably shedding because it's not getting enough water, and it's right in my south facing window. But now that it's just like in straight water and it's still shedding, I'm like, I don't know, unless this is one of the very like few rhipsalis that requires a lot of fertilizer. I don't know, but I'm not quite at the point yet where I want to give up on it, just because it's so cool. It just looks like a little alien. I don't know who it reminds me of. It kind of reminds me of one of the aliens in Lilo and Stitch for some reason, and I don't know why. I'm gonna throw them up here. And now that the photo is up and I'm probably looking at it as I'm editing, I'm like, no, I don't know why, but just at the top of my mind, it just kind of reminds me of that. Anyway, yeah, that's the salicornioides. I don't really have much else to say about this. Oh, I mean, it's living, so before it was living in my south-facing window, now this cutting is living on a shelf underneath the Brina, still shedding, still giving me the same amount of grief. I don't know. I really don't know what it is. Second to last one is another newer acquisition. Can't remember when I got this. I think I might have gotten this in California. Did I? I can't remember. So this is a rhipsalis pilocarpa. This is one that I talked about. I think I talked about it in a wishlist video, and I was saying how I didn't want to take it home because I thought these fuzzies were gonna be like cacti spikes and like would impale you, but it's not. It's just fuzz. It's just fuzz, so I don't mind it, and it's actually really cute. It's not trailing just yet. This is like the most that it's trailing, but I didn't grow this. So this is kind of where my baccifera started. Not as big and bushy of a pot, because I did acquire this as like a 6-inch plant, but meaning like it was just kind of barely spilling over the sides. So I'm really not expecting a trailing pilocarpa probably for another 2 years, honestly, but I'm willing to be patient because it does have like really thick, fat, juicy spaghetti noodles, even thicker than the baccifera, and it's kind of like the baccifera with fuzz. And now that I have it and it's in my collection, I actually really, really love it, and I'm so happy to have it. This one is in no drainage as well. It's in soil. It's in a pretty, I know it doesn't look like it, but it's actually in a pretty chunky mix. I can see a lot of coarse perlite. I can see even leca. I can see pon in here. Yeah, so far so good. It's been pretty easy. I haven't really had any trouble with this. It's not shedded. It's not shed at all since I've had it. So she's been good. She's been a good girl. And if you like a nice fuzzy plant, but you don't want to be pricked by like the fuzz, because there are plants that have this same kind of fuzz, but it'll actually like stick in your skin, this is a good one to have. Last but certainly not least is my rhipsalis paradoxa minor, and I just love this thing so much. This was another big wish list plant for me before I had it. It's been called something else too. Gosh, I can't remember what the name is, but every time I talk about this plant, they're like, I get at least one comment that's like, that's not what it's called. It's called this, and it kind of sounds like a place in maybe South America. I can't think of it right now. But anyway, I'm calling it the rhipsalis paradoxa minor. This is just like spaghetti noodle heaven. I acquired it already as like a pretty long trailing plant. It was probably about this long, but it has grown quite a bit in my care. I used to have a second one that I sold. I split it into like 4 different pots, sold it, got rid of it because this is enough for me. Honestly, I was thinking about combining them, but where it is on my shelf, I always kind of like rotate it between shelves here. It's just a little bit too much. It's a little bit too big. It's not like the rhipsalis paradoxa where it doesn't have like longer spaghetti noodles when it branches off. This one likes to branch off a lot, kind of like the capilliformis. So having an even bushier pot is just not very feasible if it's gonna live there. There was a point in time where it was hanging in my south-facing window on one of the leather plant hangers from the variegated plant shop, but it just dried out so fast. It dried out way too fast, and I couldn't keep up with it, so now it's living back on this shelf. Anywho, also living in no drainage. It's in soil, it's got leca down at the bottom. It's growing all of this moss in here, which is actually kind of cool. It's got like its own little ecosystem in here, and it actually seems very happy. This one is, it looks like it could probably be repot, but I kind of like to keep my rhipsalis a bit more root bound before I move them. So this one's gonna probably live here for like another year, maybe longer. Watering requirements, very forgiving, I will say, when it's dry. I've let this thing dry out so bad, and I haven't noticed any like dry rot really. Has very, again, similar roots to a Hoya where it can go longer periods without water. I don't really notice when it's thirsty. Like the noodles don't look very different. It's not like they super shrivel up or anything. They kind of just hold its shape. So in that way, it can be very deceiving. So you wanna, to me, it's easier to have a vessel that's clear so that I can actually see what's going on in there, because these will not really tell you a whole lot. That's just been my experience. So anywho, if I could recommend another rhipsalis, if you're like into the texture, if you love touching your plants, and you want one that's gonna grow, I would say pretty quickly, this would be another recommendation. So that is the entire collection. It felt like a humble collection, and I thought I was gonna be able to get through that in like 20 minutes, but yeah, that actually felt like a lot. So now I'm just gonna go through some of your questions really quick. There's not very many. I actually got quite a few questions, but they were like kind of all the same, so that was good. People wanted to know, first off, what my preferred substrate is for rhipsalis, and I have to say that soil has just been the best for me. I did have some of these in pond to start, but I don't know why. To me, this just seems like a species of plant that just loves an organic mixture or loves an organic substrate. So soil has been my go-to. Of course, I have the paradoxa in pond and it's doing just fine, but there's a part of me that like kind of wants to move it to soil at some point. I just haven't really decided yet. But yeah, I would say soil is my go-to mix. And if you want to know what is in the soil mix, so it's just soil. Some people ask like, what is soil? So you can use like a peat moss based soil. I literally just buy soil, which is just like organic matter, basically. Very dense, very smelly. It's just those huge bags that people use for like outdoor gardening. I've even used a sea soil before, but that one was a little bit too rich for me. So yeah, it's just soil. It's perlite, both coarse and fine. Fir bark, I use the reptile fir bark. I use worm castings. Sometimes I'll add a little bit of pumice just to make it a little bit more like gritty. And then also, what is it? Horticultural charcoal. Almost identical to my aeroid mix, except that I do add pumice sometimes. Another question that I got was, what is your recommended lighting for rhipsalis? So I think one of the biggest misconceptions about rhipsalis that I've seen in like forums and even like care websites are that they love like full sun. And while they can do fine in full sun. Like my rhipsalis paradoxa minor was in full sun for a long time. They don't necessarily need it, and they actually can grow just fine in lower light conditions. So I've never actually like grown it in like direct sun for a very prolonged period of time, and maybe that's why none of my rhipsalis have been able to sun stress, because they can sun stress like Hoyas. They turn like a bright pink, which is really beautiful, and they can flower. That was another question, like how do you get it to flower? I have no clue. I've actually never successfully had any of my rhipsalis flower before, but I think light has a lot to do with it, and the intensity of light and how many hours of direct light it's getting a day. But I will say that my grandma's flowered, and so did I think my mom's. No, I think it was just my grandma's that flowered, and she had a cutting from my plant, and hers I'm pretty sure was just growing under grow lights. So unfortunately, I'm not the person to ask about flowering, but I will say that I do have a lot of experience growing rhipsalis in lower light conditions, especially living in a place like Canada. Like I mentioned, like when you're not, it's not a day like this where it's very sunny, and again, we don't have very many of these days. On this shelf, it's getting very, very little light. Like yes, I have very large windows, but with the overcast, it's like basically nothing. And I think if you guys saw how dark it can actually get like over the peak of winter and like the cold months or the cold season, I think a lot of plant people would be inclined to put in some kind of like light to shine directly onto the plants. But my sort of outlook with my plant over here is that it's just like survival of the fittest. I've given some lights, like I've put some grow lights on the shelves, but other than that, if you're not gonna grow well in these conditions, then I'm probably gonna get rid of you. But my rhipsalis have been totally fine in lower light conditions, so I wouldn't allow the fear of not enough light prevent you from actually acquiring a rhipsalis and owning one, because I find they grow just fine in sort of like regular conditions, not getting direct sunlight, and yeah, it's been fine. And then the most frequently asked question that I got about rhipsalis is, how do you propagate it? I probably got 40 to 50 people that all said that they were struggling with propagating. They didn't know how to do it. It kept rotting. So I actually want to spend the most time talking about propagating rhipsalis. So sorry, I keep looking at my notes here. So one of the questions in regard to propagating is, how do you prevent watering? So my recommendation is, obviously you want to use something clean, like a clean tool. You don't want to use a dirty scissor or one that you just cut like a big old nasty chunk with and then chop your rhipsalis, because you have like the risk of transferring bacteria. So always sterilize your tools before you're cutting. And you want to make sure that the cutting that you have is at least 6 inches long. I have had luck with propagating smaller pieces of rhipsalis, but I find that the chances of it rotting completely and not ever rooting is a lot higher when the cutting is so small. So 6 inches is going to be like a safe number. If you can even go more than 6 inches, that's even better, because you want to give a little bit of room for rotting. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but rhipsalis, they just have a tendency to rot. But I've found that with certain rules to follow, you can really prevent that. So having a bigger cutting is going to be my first suggestion. Second one is going to be to allow it to callus. I know that there are people out there that are just anti-callusing. They just don't believe that it does anything, and if it works for you, that's totally fine. But for me, I like to just be on the safer side. So when you're propagating a rhipsalis, I would recommend a minimum of callusing for 2 hours to 24 to 48 hours. You're not gonna find that the rhipsalis is going to dry up like a begonia after you chop it. Or even, I mean, even like aroids can go long periods of just being completely rootless, not being in water for, I would say, 2 to 3 days and be totally fine. So rhipsalis are kind of the same way. Like I could cut a rhipsalis and leave it for like a week just sitting like on a table, and it would be totally fine. But I wouldn't really recommend going that long. To me, my ideal is a 24-hour callus. But if you're in a pinch, 2 hours is good. You just want to make sure that after you chop it, when you touch that tissue that has been cut, I mean, really, you don't want to touch it if you can help it, but if you kind of feel it, you'll feel that it's like really hard and just like nice and calloused. It's completely like healed over, and you're not going to get any like yucky bacteria into the fleshy part of the tissue. So callousing to me is very important. And on top of also callousing, I dip it into a root, I call it a callousing hormone mixture, and it's just equal parts of sulfur powder, rooting hormone in powder form, and cinnamon. There have been so many posts I've seen where it's like, stop putting cinnamon on your plants, it doesn't do anything. But I don't know, I find that that mixture is just like my magic mix in terms of callousing things like big chunks of anthurium, big chunks of philodendron, and then rhipsalis. You just, when it's a fresh cut, I just dip it into there, leave it to callus for 24 hours. And all of the things that I use in my callousing mix, I've been able to find on Amazon and at the garden center. Sorry about Pudge, he really wants to come out, but I just need to I need to power through this. And then I got a question that said, what do you use for fresh cuts? And I know this might sound a little bit counterproductive or counterintuitive when I'm talking about a rotting, like rhipsalis being more prone to rotting, but water is my favorite substrate to go to for rooting rhipsalis. Before you go into water though, you really want to make sure it's calloused. If you're going to do the water method, I would recommend callousing for 2 days if you can, if not at least a full day. I wouldn't callus for 2 hours or 3 hours and then go to water, unless you have a very barky, and I'm going to show you here, unless you have a very barky stem like this salicornioides. I found that like a couple hours callousing is totally fine for a stem like that, but I would not, like for a paradoxa, I wouldn't callus it for 2 to 3 hours and then stick it in water. Another method that I like to use is perlite or pon. The only thing with doing perlite or pon is that you don't want to treat it like a semi-hydro vessel. So, and what I mean by that is the best thing you can do is wet your substrate, like completely drench it. So if you have perlite, soak all of the perlite in water for 10-15 minutes, soak your pon for 10-15 minutes, and then dump it into a strainer, and then immediately use that for your substrate. So I don't really ever leave a reserve of water inside of that vessel. I just make sure that the substrate is really wet and it has like absorbed as much water as possible, but I really don't leave any water at the bottom for it to sit, or else I find that the rotting is typically higher when you do it that way. And then in terms of like the conditions to give it while it's propagating, I don't do anything special. I don't ever do like a propagation dome. I don't put it in like any kind of like high humidity thing. I really just give it whatever it was given before. I put a lot of my propagations in my plant room, just on a regular shelf, sitting out in ambient conditions. But I do make sure to give it a good amount of light, and a good amount of light means like direct rays from a grow light. And the grow lights that I'm using primarily right now are the 10-watt Barinas. And in terms of how far to bury the propagated stem into your substrate, if you can stick at least like 3 inches inside, that is perfect. 3 to 4 inches is golden, which is why you want a longer propagation to work with. So I'm actually going to just propagate a few of my rhipsalis on camera. I really didn't have plans to do a propagating, but I figure why not just show you like where I chop it, how I chop it, whatever. So again, you want to use a clean tool. I'm gonna propagate my rhipsalis paradoxa minor first. So what you want to do is find a knuckle. I really don't ever chop in the middle of a spaghetti noodle. I will always try and find a knuckle like this and chop it right at the knuckle. I'm gonna pull from one that has gotten really long. So right here we have a really big guy, and I'm going to just chop it right here. Oops. I'm gonna chop it right here. at this knuckle. If you can see, got a big old cutting here, and then I'm even going to chop this down further. So looking at this is a nice length to work with. So I'm gonna again chop it at this knuckle, and then I'm even gonna chop it again at this one here. And then I've got this like little weirdo cutting here. This isn't like the ideal propagation. Like if I sell this or I add it back to the pot, I don't really want it to look like this. So I am gonna be chopping it again at these knuckles. Sorry, it's hard to do it on camera. And then I'm gonna push it. I could probably even break it, but I don't want to. So here is what all of the fleshy tissue looks like. Very, very green, very soft, very wet. You don't typically want to stick a fresh cutting like this straight into a wet substrate, because the tendency of a really, you know, meaty rhipsalis, like a thick rhipsalis like this, you really don't want it to be sitting in something wet right away until it's had a chance to callus over. And then I'm going to propagate my rhipsalis paradoxa. This is kind of the same spiel. Maybe we can take from the longest stem here. I'm gonna try to do this without breaking the whole thing. So I've got a knuckle right here that I'm going to chop at. And I don't really feel the need to chop it again here because these are just a little bit too small to propagate. So I will just propagate this whole thing. Now, if you can even find like the perfect stem to choose from that already has these aerial roots sticking out, your chances of rooting are gonna be so much better and so much faster. But for the sake of this propagation, I wouldn't chop this down just to get these roots in, just because I would want a larger piece to work with. But if you are not feeling super confident in your propagation abilities with rhipsalis just yet, yeah, I would try and chop where one of these aerial roots are. So here's a really good piece. If I wanted to chop it again, I could chop it right here, and then I could stick this whole thing maybe like two or 3 inches into the substrate, and these are like gonna change the game for you in terms of how fast your rhipsalis is gonna root. But I don't necessarily want to take that big of a cutting today, so I'm gonna leave it. We can do my rhipsalis baccifera on camera. Actually, I kind of like the way this is growing right now, you guys, and I don't really feel the need to propagate this one and get it back into the pot. So let's skip this one. But I think I can afford to take some of my capilliformis down. I did chop this recently for Lauren, for one of her customers. But with this one, I'm less likely to take at a knuckle and just kind of chop it wherever. Like, I rarely ever spend the time to like find the little knuckles and like chop it. This is one of those like exceptions that I would just like trim, callus, and then stick the whole thing in. I have like one randomly long guy down here, so maybe I'll, oh my gosh, these are heavy. Maybe I'll just chop this one down. So here is the piece that I'm working with. Super, super long. I mean, now that I kind of just have it in front of me, I could chop it at a knuckle, but I don't know. I don't really feel the need to. I think I'm gonna chop like right here where I can see this little aerial root. I can't even tell if it's focused, and I'm just gonna chop. And I would say that this is a decent cutting to work with. I'm probably not gonna pot this back in the pot, but I might propagate and sell it. I feel like you might get the point in terms of how to propagate rhipsalis. Just cut at the knuckle if you can. There are some exceptions, but most rhipsalis are gonna have knuckles for you to work with. And then the second to last question that I got is, how do you fertilize them and how often? So I don't really do anything specific with my rhipsalis. They pretty much are on the same fertilizing regimen and routine and schedule as the rest of my collection. It's just that saying water or fertilize weekly. fertilize weekly. And yeah, it's either gonna be TPS1, CalMag, Silica. It's getting something every week, but just in very, very diluted amounts. Again, I don't know if maybe how weekly I'm fertilizing my rhipsalis has anything to do with the fact that they have never flowered, but my goal with my rhipsalis is to not have them flower. I don't buy them for the flowers. They are pretty, they're really cute. They have like these little tiny balls that are just adorable. They're either like white, pink, or like yellow, but I don't buy it for the flowers. I buy it for the foliage, so that hasn't really been an issue for me. But yeah, in terms of fertilizing, it's gonna be the same that I do for the rest of my collection. And then the last question that I got are like, what are your wish list rhipsalis right now? And I have a few. So I'm gonna quickly just go through them really fast and throw them up on the screen. The first one is a rhipsalis clavata. This one is so cool because they look like little bells. Like you could just like dangle them like this. And I don't know what it is about it. It's not like a noodle. It kind of like tapers at the knuckle and then gets a little bit bigger. And I think that's why it kind of like looks bell-like to me. It does have like more tendency to branch off. So I don't know, it has like such a cool, whimsical look, and I just think it would be really fun. It kind of looks like it could be similar to the capilliformis, but just thicker, not as like skinny and gangly. Another one would be the rhipsalis agudoensis. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this one looks so cool. It kind of reminds me of a cissus, like my cissus quadrangularis. I know you can't see it in the frame right now, but the stems, they look so much like a cissus to me. Even the growth pattern and how it's like so thick and rigid, and it kind of like finds its own way. Whoa, the lighting. How it kind of like grows up or grows sideways and just kind of grows wherever it wants. I just love a plant like that, like when it has like a mind of its own, so I would really love to have this if I could find one. And then again, like I mentioned before, the rhipsalis pentaptera. Arium Botanicals had like the biggest baskets of them a while back, and I missed it, and I regret it so much. I love the pentaptera a lot, which is why I bought the one that I thought was a pentaptera, but it ended up not being one. But I think I like it because it reminds me of the cissus quadrangularis, and that it's so angular and it's just so fat and thick and juicy, and I would just love to have one. And then the last one is a rhipsalis flacosa. So this one kind of reminds me of the hoelleri if it had curls like a nice beach wave. It's like a hoelleri with a beach wave, and they really do look like spaghetti noodles, like legit spaghetti noodles, and it looks kind of creepy but really cool as a big trailing basket. And I don't know, I just want more trailing plants in my life. Not trailing plants, but trailing rhipsalis specifically, or trailing weirdo plants, not trailing pothos, trailing philodendron. I want more of these guys. They just make me so happy. I love them just as much as I love my aeroids. So yeah, a flacosa would be so cool to have, and it kind of looks like it has like a shinier texture, like a glossy texture, unlike the hoelleri where it's very matte and no shine. But it could just be some of the photos that I've seen, but it just looks like they would be a little bit more shiny. But anyway, you guys, that is gonna wrap it up for my rhipsalis video. I hope I answered and covered everything that you might have had lingering in your minds about rhipsalis. If I can leave you with one thing about them, is that they are absolutely worth it. I would be wary of buying rhipsalis under the idea that it is. A lot of shops get them wrong. A lot of people can't properly ID them, especially when they're really small, myself included. Like if you really want a certain rhipsalis, like make sure it's what it is, get it double checked, post it in a Facebook group, make sure it's that, because some of the price tags on a few of these rhipsalis are just kind of crazy still. And so you don't want to waste your money that way. But They are absolutely worth it to me. They are so rewarding to grow. They're so fun to have in the house, and they make a great addition to a lot of these aroids that we have. My face looks crazy right now with this lighting, so I'm gonna go, I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna stop blabbing, but I hope you guys got some good use out of it. If you still have any outstanding questions, please feel free to leave it in the comments, and I will be sure to answer it. I hope I can be sure to answer it. I'm trying to be better at answering comments, but I can't keep up with them, you guys. It's so hard. But I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Let me know what your wishlist rhipsalis are, or rhipsalis I should be adding to my radar. I'm telling you, 2024, it's gonna be year of the trailing plants, mark my words. So anywho, thanks for hanging out with me again, you guys, and I will see you in the next one.